"Sir, you cannot stay here. This is private property. You need to leave." The security guard's voice was cold, dismissive, the kind of tone reserved for people who didn't matter. He didn't even look at the disheveled American man standing before him, just gestured toward the street with his nightstick, already turning away. Jonathan Cross stood in the harsh Manila sun, sweat dripping down his face, wearing clothes he had bought from a second-hand store for less than the cost of his usual morning coffee. His designer watch was gone. His platinum credit cards were locked in a hotel safe across the city. His phone was a burner. No contacts, no apps, no connection to the empire he had built. He was, for all intents and purposes, nobody. And for the first time in his 53 years on this earth, Jonathan Cross was learning what that actually meant. "Please," he said, the word foreign on his tongue. When was the last time he had said please to anyone and meant it? "I just need to rest for a moment. I haven't eaten since yesterday." The guard finally looked at him, really looked at him, and what Jonathan saw in his eyes was worse than hostility. It was complete and utter indifference. The look you give to a stray dog you've seen 100 times before. "Not my problem. Move along, or I call the police." Jonathan moved along. "Now, before we go any further, I need you to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what this billionaire is about to experience in the streets of Manila is going to change everything he thought he knew about poverty, about wealth, and about the human heart. Drop a comment telling me what you think he's going to discover. Trust me, you're not ready for where this goes. 3 days earlier, Jonathan Cross had been sitting in the boardroom of Cross Industries, a multinational conglomerate worth $47 billion, listening to his executives' present quarterly earnings. The numbers were excellent. They were always excellent. Jonathan had spent 30 years building an empire that generated wealth with mechanical efficiency. Shipping, manufacturing, technology, real estate. His face had graced the covers of Forbes and Bloomberg. His name was spoken with reverence in financial circles around the world. But something was wrong. He couldn't pinpoint when it had started, this hollowness that had taken root in his chest. Maybe it was after his third divorce, when his ex-wife had looked at him with tears in her eyes and said, "You don't know how to be human anymore, Jonathan. You only know how to be rich." Maybe it was after his estranged daughter's wedding, which he had attended alone, watching her dance with her new husband while he sat at a table full of strangers who only wanted to talk about investment opportunities. Or maybe it was last month when his doctor had sat him down and told him the stress was killing him, that if he didn't change something, really change, he would be dead within 5 years. "What do you want me to change?" Jonathan had asked. The doctor had shrugged. "That's not my department, Mr. Cross. But I'd suggest starting with whatever is eating you alive from the inside out." That night, alone in his penthouse overlooking Central Park, Jonathan had made a decision. He would disappear. Not permanently, just long enough to remember what it felt like to be human. To experience the world without the buffer of wealth, without the protection of power, without the constant awareness that everyone around him wanted something from him. He chose the Philippines because it was far from everything he knew. Because his company had manufacturing operations there that he had never visited, only reviewed through spreadsheets and profit margins. Because he wanted to see, firsthand, what life looked like for the people his business decisions affected. And because, in some deep part of himself he barely acknowledged, he wanted to know if kindness still existed in a world that had shown him so little of it. The first 2 days had been a revelation. Jonathan had arrived in Manila with nothing but the clothes on his back, a small amount of pesos in his pocket, and a cover story. He was an American who had been robbed, stranded, waiting for his family to wire him money that never seemed to arrive. The story was designed to elicit sympathy. Instead, it had elicited suspicion, contempt, and doors slammed in his face. Hotels turned him away because he couldn't provide a credit card for incidentals. Restaurants refused to serve him because his appearance suggested he couldn't pay. Even some churches had looked at him with wary eyes, offering prayers but no practical assistance. The wealthy Filipinos he encountered were the worst. They looked through him exactly the way wealthy Americans looked through the homeless in New York, as if poverty were a contagious disease they might catch through eye contact. But it was the other poor people who surprised him most. He had expected solidarity, brotherhood, the shared understanding of struggle that would naturally lead to mutual support. Instead, he found competition. Resources were scarce, and everyone was fighting for survival. The man begging on one corner saw him as a threat, another mouth to feed, another hand reaching for the same limited charity. The families crowding into makeshift shelters had no room for strangers. The street vendors who might have offered him food scraps were themselves barely getting by. Poverty, Jonathan was learning, was not romantic. It was not noble. It was brutal, grinding, and desperately lonely. By the end of day 2, he had not eaten in 36 hours. He had slept on a concrete bench in a park, waking every few hours to the sound of motorcycles and distant music. His body ached. His pride was shattered. And for the first time in decades, Jonathan Cross felt genuine fear. What if no one helped him? What if he had built his entire empire on the belief that humanity was fundamentally selfish, and he had been right all along? Day 3 brought him Tondo. He had heard about Tondo from his executives, one of the most densely populated areas in the world, home to some of Manila's poorest residents. His company had considered building a facility there once, but the risk assessment had deemed it unsuitable for investment. Now, walking through its narrow streets, Jonathan understood why. The poverty here was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. Makeshift homes built from scrap metal and plastic tarps. Children playing in streets that doubled as open sewers. The smell of garbage and cooking oil and humanity packed too tightly together. And everywhere, eyes watching him. The foreigner who had stumbled into a world he clearly didn't belong to. He found a spot near a small sari-sari store, one of the tiny convenience shops that seemed to exist on every corner, and sat down on an overturned crate, too exhausted to go any further. 3 days without real food. 3 days of rejection. 3 days of learning what it meant to be invisible. He closed his eyes and wondered if this was how he died. Not in a hospital surrounded by doctors money could buy, but on a street corner in a place his spreadsheets had dismissed as unsuitable. Gui, okay ka lang ba? The voice was young, female, gentle. Jonathan opened his eyes. A girl stood before him, maybe 16 or 17 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that held a warmth he hadn't seen in days. She was thin, wearing a faded school uniform that had been patched and repaired multiple times, carrying a plastic bag that seemed to contain her only possessions. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, his voice cracking. "I don't speak. Are you okay?" She switched to English, her accent thick, but her words clear. You look not good, Kuya." Kuya. He had learned enough to know it meant something like older brother, a term of respect, of connection, used even with strangers. "I'm just tired," he managed. "I haven't eaten in a while." The girl studied him for a long moment. He could see her calculating, this stranger, this foreigner, this potential threat or potential victim. He had seen that calculation in the eyes of everyone he had encountered. But then something shifted in her expression. "Wait here," she said. "Don't move, huh? I come back." She disappeared into the maze of narrow alleys before Jonathan could respond. He didn't expect her to return. Why would she? She had nothing to gain from helping him. He was just another problem in a life that was already full of them. But 10 minutes later, she was back. And in her hands, she carried a small styrofoam container of steaming rice, topped with a piece of fried fish and a few vegetables. "Here." She pressed the container into his hands. "Eat. You need to eat." Jonathan stared at the food, simple, humble, probably worth less than $1, and felt tears burning behind his eyes. "I can't take this from you," he whispered. "I have nothing to give you in return." The girl smiled, a smile that seemed to light up the entire street. "That's okay, Kuya. You don't need to give me anything. You just need to eat." She sat down on the crate beside him, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and watched him with patient eyes until he finally lifted the plastic spoon and began to eat. It was the most delicious meal Jonathan Cross had ever tasted. This girl has nothing, less than nothing, and yet she's the only person in 3 days who has shown this billionaire basic human kindness. Who is she? What's her story? And what happens when Jonathan discovers the truth about her life? Subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment. Next is where everything changes. Let me continue. My name is Esperanza, but everyone calls me Esper. The girl sat beside Jonathan on the overturned crate, watching him eat with the satisfied expression of a mother watching her child. The late afternoon sun filtered through the gaps between the makeshift buildings, casting golden light across her face. Esperanza, Jonathan repeated, his mouth full of rice. That means hope, doesn't it? You know Spanish? Esper looked surprised. A little. I learned it for business reasons. The words felt hollow even as he said them. Everything in his life had been for business reasons. Yes, it means hope. Esper smiled again, and Jonathan noticed for the first time how tired her eyes were, how much they had seen for someone so young. My mother named me that because she said I was born during a storm, the worst storm of the year. And when it was over and I was still alive, she said I was her hope that things would get better. Did they? Get better. The smile flickered but didn't fade. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. That's life, DBA. Not always good, not always bad. Just life. Jonathan set down his empty container, feeling more human than he had in days. Esper, that food you gave me, where did it come from? You shouldn't have spent your money on a stranger. Esper was quiet for a moment. I didn't buy it, she finally admitted. That was my dinner. I saved it from lunch at school because I don't eat dinner anyway. It's easier to sleep when you're not hungry at night. The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow. She had given him her only meal. I can't. He tried to hand back the container, but it was already empty. Esper, why would you do that? You don't know me. I could be anyone. That's why I did it. Esper's voice was matter of fact, as if she were explaining something obvious. Because you could be anyone. When my father died, we had nothing. No money, no food, nowhere to go. And people walked past us every day like we were invisible. She looked out at the crowded street. But one day, a stranger stopped. He didn't have much either, just a construction worker, I think, but he gave us his lunch and sat with us while we ate. He said his father had taught him that the poor must take care of the poor because nobody else will. She turned back to Jonathan. I never forgot that. So when I see someone who needs help, I help. Because maybe someday, someone will help me too. Jonathan felt something crack open in his chest, something that had been sealed shut for decades. Tell me about yourself, he said quietly. Tell me about your life. And Esper, with the trusting openness of someone who had nothing left to hide, began to talk. If this moment is hitting you hard, smash that like button right now. Because Esper's story is about to break your heart in ways you're not prepared for. Esperanza Santos was 17 years old. Her father had been a fisherman, a good man, she said, with rough hands and a gentle heart. He had died 5 years ago when his boat capsized during a typhoon. They never recovered his body. Her mother had tried to hold the family together after that, taking in laundry, cleaning houses, doing whatever work she could find. But the grief had been too heavy. She had gotten sick, first in her mind, then in her body. She died 3 years ago, leaving Esper and her younger brother, Miguel, alone in the world. We went to live with our aunt, Esper explained. She's not a bad person, but she has 6 children of her own. There isn't enough space. There isn't enough food. There isn't enough anything. She paused, picking at a loose thread on her uniform. I stopped going to school for a while because I had to work. But then a teacher, Ma'am Reyes, she came to find me. She said education was my only way out. She convinced my aunt to let me go back, and she helps me with the fees when she can. What about your brother, Miguel? Esper's face softened. He's 10 now. Smart. So much smarter than me. He wants to be a doctor someday. She laughed quietly. I tell him that's impossible, that we're too poor, that doctors come from rich families. But he doesn't listen. He says if I can keep going to school, he can too. What do you want to be? Jonathan asked. Esper was quiet for a long moment. I used to want to be a teacher. Like Ma'am Reyes. Someone who helps children like me. She shook her head slightly. But now I just want to survive. To make sure Miguel survives. To make it through each day without giving up. She looked at Jonathan with eyes that were suddenly, startlingly old. That's what poverty does to you, Kuya. It takes away your dreams and replaces them with smaller things. Not what do I want to become, but where will I sleep tonight? Not what will I do with my life, but will I eat tomorrow? Jonathan felt tears sliding down his cheeks. He didn't try to hide them. Esper, how much money do you have? Right now in total? She thought about it. Maybe 150 pesos? Enough for a few days of rice and sardines, if I'm careful. I get paid at the end of the week for helping at the Sari Sari store. 150 pesos. Approximately $3. This girl had $3 to her name, and she had given a stranger her dinner. What would you do? Jonathan asked slowly. If you suddenly had money. Real money. Enough to do anything you wanted. Esper laughed. A genuine, surprised sound. That's a strange question, Kuya. Why would you ask that? Just humor me. If you could have anything in the world, what would it be? She thought about it seriously, as if the question deserved real consideration. I would pay for Miguel's school first, all the way through, so he never has to worry about fees or books or uniforms. Then I would find a small apartment for us. Nothing fancy, just somewhere safe and clean where we could be together. She paused, and I would buy my aunt a refrigerator. She's always wanted one. She says if she had a refrigerator, she could keep food from spoiling, and her children wouldn't get sick so often. That was it. Her brother's education. A small apartment. A refrigerator for the aunt who had taken her in. No mansions. No cars. No jewelry or designer clothes or luxury vacations. Just basic security for the people she loved. Jonathan had spent $47 billion building an empire, and this girl, this teenager with $3 to her name, had clearer priorities than he had ever had in his life. The sun was setting by the time Esper stood to leave. I have to go home now, she said apologetically. My aunt will worry, and Miguel needs help with his homework. Jonathan stood too, feeling the stiffness in his bones from days of sleeping on concrete. Esper, wait. I need to tell you something. She tilted her head, curious. He opened his mouth to confess, to tell her who he really was, to explain the experiment, to offer her everything she had ever dreamed of and more. But the words wouldn't come, because he realized with sudden clarity that if he told her the truth now, he would ruin everything. She hadn't helped him because she expected a reward. She had helped him because that was who she was. If he revealed his wealth now, her kindness would become a transaction. Her pure, selfless act would be contaminated by the knowledge that she had helped a billionaire and could expect something in return. He couldn't do that to her. So instead, he said, "Thank you for the food, for sitting with me, for reminding me that good people still exist." Esper smiled her radiant smile. "You're welcome, Kuya. Will you be okay tonight? Do you have somewhere to sleep? I'll figure something out." She hesitated, clearly wanting to offer more, but knowing she had nothing left to give. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled 20-peso bill. "Here. It's not much, but no." Jonathan's voice was firm. "Absolutely not. You've already given me more than I deserve." But Esper, he took her hand and gently closed her fingers around the bill. "You keep that. Use it for Miguel. Promise me." She looked at him for a long moment, something flickering in her eyes that he couldn't quite read. "Okay, Kuya, I promise." She turned to go, then paused. "Will I see you again?" Jonathan knew what he should say. He should say no, should disappear into the night, and in the experiment, should go back to his hotel and his credit cards and his old life. But instead, he heard himself say, "Yes, I'll find you. I promise." Esper smiled one more time, then vanished into the labyrinth of narrow streets, leaving Jonathan alone with his thoughts and his tears and a decision that would change everything. That night, Jonathan didn't go back to his hotel. He found a spot near a church, one of the ones that had turned him away earlier, and sat on the steps, watching the stars emerge above the Manila skyline. His body was exhausted, but his mind was racing. For 30 years, he had believed that success was measured in numbers. Revenue, profit margins, market share, net worth. He had pursued those numbers with single-minded determination, sacrificing relationships and health and happiness in the process. And what had it gotten him? 3 divorces, a daughter who barely spoke to him, a doctor telling him he was dying from stress, and a hollowness in his chest that no amount of money had ever been able to fill. But Esper had nothing. No money, no security, no certainty about where her next meal would come from. And yet she had more peace, more purpose, more genuine human connection than Jonathan had experienced in decades. She had given a stranger her only dinner not because she expected something in return, but because it was the right thing to do. Because someone had once helped her, and she wanted to pass that kindness forward. Because she understood, in a way that Jonathan was only beginning to grasp, that the measure of a person wasn't in what they had, but in what they gave. He thought about his company, the thousands of employees who worked for him, many of them in countries just like this, in conditions he had never bothered to examine closely. He thought about the decisions he made in boardrooms, the numbers he optimized, the efficiencies he demanded, never once considering the human beings behind the spreadsheets. He thought about Esper's aunt, who wanted a refrigerator so her children wouldn't get sick. He thought about Miguel, who dreamed of being a doctor. He thought about Mam Reyes, the teacher who had searched for a dropout and convinced her to come back to school. These were the people his decisions affected. Real people, with real dreams, living real lives of struggle and hope and resilience. And he had never seen them, never tried to see them, had been too busy counting his billions to notice the human cost of his success. Jonathan put his head in his hands and wept, really wept, the way he hadn't since he was a child, great heaving sobs that shook his entire body. He wept for the man he had become and the man he had failed to be. He wept for the marriages he had destroyed and the daughter he had neglected. He wept for 30 years of empty success and hollow victories. And somewhere in the midst of that weeping, something shifted. He didn't just want to give Esper money. He wanted to become the kind of person who deserved to know her. That's the end of part 2. Jonathan has been broken open in ways he never expected, and now he has to make a choice. Go back to his old life and forget everything he's learned, or become someone entirely new. If you're feeling this transformation in your soul, subscribe right now, so you won't forget to do that. Jonathan returned to his hotel that night. He showered for the first time in 3 days, ate a proper meal, and slept in a bed that cost more per night than Esper's family earned in a month. But he didn't return to his old self. Something had fundamentally changed. He spent the next week in Manila, but not as a tourist or a businessman. He spent it learning, really learning, about the lives of the people his company employed. He visited factories, talked to workers, listened to their stories. He discovered that the efficiency metrics his executives celebrated often came at the cost of fair wages and safe conditions. He discovered that the decisions made in his boardroom had human consequences he had never bothered to imagine. And every day, he returned to Tondo. He didn't reveal his identity, not yet. He simply showed up, wearing the same worn clothes, sitting on the same corner, waiting for Esper to pass by on her way home from school. She always stopped, always shared whatever she had, a piece of bread, a handful of peanuts, a few minutes of conversation. She never asked for anything in return. "You're looking better, Kuya," she told him on the 3rd day. "Did you find food? Somewhere to sleep?" "I'm managing," he said, which was technically true. "Good." She sat down beside him, seemingly unconcerned about the curious looks from passersby. "Maya says I'm crazy for talking to strangers. She says Americans are dangerous." Jonathan smiled slightly. "What do you think?" "I think everyone is dangerous if you give them a reason to be. But I also think everyone can be kind if you give them a chance." She shrugged. "Besides, you don't seem dangerous. You seem sad." "Sad?" "Yes. Like someone who lost something important and doesn't know how to find it again." The accuracy of her observation stunned him into silence. "My mother used to say that sadness was just love with nowhere to go," Esper continued. "Maybe that's what you need, Kuya. A place to put your love." She said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if she were dispensing common wisdom rather than the most profound insight Jonathan had heard in decades. "Esper," he said slowly, "what would you say if I told you I wasn't who you think I am?" She looked at him curiously. "What do you mean?" Jonathan hesitated. He had been planning this moment all week, had scripted and rehearsed and reimagined it 100 times. But now that it was here, all his carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. So he just told the truth. "My name is Jonathan Cross. I'm not broke. I'm not stranded. I'm one of the wealthiest men in America." Esper stared at him. I came to the Philippines because I wanted to understand what life was like for people who had nothing. I wanted to know if kindness still existed in the world or if everyone was just looking out for themselves. He met her eyes. In 3 days of pretending to be poor, I was rejected by hotels, restaurants, churches, and strangers on the street. Hundreds of people walked past me without a second glance. Security guards threatened me. Wealthy people looked through me like I was invisible. His voice cracked. And then you, a 17-year-old girl with $3 to her name, gave me your dinner. Your only meal for the day. You sat with me while I ate. You treated me like a human being. Esper said nothing. Her expression was unreadable. I've spent my whole life believing that money was the measure of everything. That the rich were successful because they were better, and the poor were poor because they deserved it. But you showed me something I had forgotten or maybe never knew in the first place. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. This is for you. Not as payment for what you did that could never be paid for, but as a gift from someone who was lost and found their way because of your kindness. Esper looked at the envelope but didn't take it. What is it? A scholarship. Full tuition, room, and board at any university in the Philippines, or abroad, if you prefer. For you and for Miguel. For as long as you need it. Her eyes widened. There's also a trust fund, Jonathan continued. For your aunt and her children. Enough for a house. A real house, not a shack. Enough for a refrigerator. Enough for food and medicine and everything they need. Esper's hand trembled as she finally took the envelope. And there's one more thing. Jonathan pulled out a second envelope. I'm restructuring my company's operations in the Philippines. Fair wages, safe conditions, healthcare, and education benefits for workers and their families. It's going to cost me millions in profit, and my shareholders are going to be furious. He smiled. But I don't care, because you taught me that the measure of a person isn't in what they have. It's in what they give. If this moment just made your heart overflow, hit that like button. Because we're not done yet. Esper sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then, slowly, she began to cry. Not the quiet, dignified tears Jonathan might have expected. These were great, heaving sobs that shook her thin shoulders. The tears of someone who had held everything together for far too long and was finally being given permission to fall apart. Jonathan didn't try to stop her. He just sat beside her, letting her cry, letting her feel whatever she needed to feel. When the tears finally subsided, Esper looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would you do this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. You're right. I don't owe you anything. Jonathan's voice was gentle. But that's exactly the point. You helped me when I had nothing to offer you. You gave me your food, your time, your humanity. Not because you expected something in return, but because that's who you are. He paused. I've spent my whole life making transactions. I give something, I get something. Everything has a price. But what you showed me, that was different. That was grace. Unearned, undeserved, freely given. He reached out and took her hand. I can't repay grace, Esper. No one can, but I can pass it on. I can become the kind of person who gives without expecting, who helps without calculating, who sees the humanity in people instead of just their utility. He looked at her with tears in his own eyes. You saved my life, not because I was dying of hunger, although I was certainly hungry, but because something in me had died long ago, and you brought it back to life. For that, I can never thank you enough. Esper was quiet for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hand and smiled through her tears. My mother used to say that God sends angels in disguise. That sometimes, when you help a stranger, you're helping someone who is sent to change your life. She laughed softly. I thought she meant the stranger would change my life. I didn't realize I would change theirs too. You did, Jonathan said. More than you'll ever know. The news of Jonathan Cross's transformation spread quickly. Financial analysts were baffled when Cross Industries announced sweeping changes to its Philippine operations. Changes that prioritized worker welfare over profit margins. Shareholders threatened lawsuits. Business pundits predicted disaster. Instead, something unexpected happened. The company's Filipino workers, no longer exhausted and afraid, became more productive. Quality improved. Turnover decreased. The investment in human dignity paid dividends that no spreadsheet could have predicted. Other companies took notice. Media outlets around the world covered the story. The American billionaire who had lived as a homeless man in Manila and emerged with a completely new philosophy of business. But the coverage that mattered most came from a small article in a Philippine newspaper, written by a young journalism student named Esperanza Santos. 3 weeks ago, the article began, I gave my dinner to a stranger. He was hungry, alone, and invisible to everyone who passed him by. I didn't know his name or his story. I just knew he needed help. That stranger turned out to be one of the wealthiest men in the world. He had come to my country in disguise, looking for something money couldn't buy. And somehow, in the crowded streets of Tondo, he found it. But here's the thing about this story that the other articles miss. What happened to Jonathan Cross wasn't magic. It wasn't a miracle. It was the same thing that happens every day in communities all over the world, between people who have nothing and give anyway. The poor take care of the poor. We have to, because nobody else will. When you have nothing, you learn that sharing is not about calculating what you'll get in return. It's about recognizing the humanity in someone else. It's about saying, through your actions, you matter. You are not invisible. I see you. Jonathan Cross came to the Philippines looking for kindness. He found it, not among the wealthy, not among the powerful, but among the people who had the least to give and gave the most. That says something important about the world, about who we are and who we could be if we tried. I don't know what the future holds for me or my family. I don't know if the opportunities I've been given will lead somewhere or nowhere. But I know this, I will never stop giving what I can to those who need it. Because kindness isn't a transaction. It's a way of being. And it's the only thing that can save us. 1 year later, Esperanza Santos stood at a podium in front of 300 people, wearing a graduation gown that was brand new. The first new piece of clothing she had owned in years. She was graduating from high school at the top of her class. In the audience, her brother Miguel sat between their aunt and Ma'am Reyes, beaming with pride. Beside them, in a seat that had been specially reserved, sat Jonathan Cross. He had flown across the world for this moment, had blocked his calendar and ignored his shareholders and told his assistants that nothing, absolutely nothing, was more important than being here. Esper caught his eye as she took her place at the microphone, and then she began to speak. 1 year ago, I was preparing to drop out of school. My family couldn't afford the fees. My aunt was struggling to feed her own children. My brother was about to lose his chance at an education before it even began. She paused. 1 year ago, I gave a stranger my dinner because he looked hungry and alone. I didn't know who he was. I didn't expect anything in return. I just did what my mother had taught me, to help when I could, to give when I had something to give, to treat every person as worthy of dignity and kindness. Her voice grew stronger. That stranger turned out to be someone who could change my life. But here's what I've learned in the past year. He didn't change my life because he was wealthy. He changed my life because he saw me. Because he recognized my humanity at a moment when the world had made him invisible, and he never forgot that. Recognition. She looked directly at Jonathan. I've been asked many times what it feels like to be helped by a billionaire. And I always give the same answer. It feels like being seen, like being valued, like being told that your life matters, that your dreams matter, that you are not invisible. Her eyes glistened. Jonathan Cross didn't just give me money. He gave me hope. He showed me that the kindness I offered could come back to me multiplied, not because of any transaction, but because that's how the universe works when we open our hearts to each other. She turned to address the graduates sitting behind her. To my fellow graduates, we come from communities that the world often overlooks. We have faced obstacles that many people cannot imagine. We have been told in 1,000 different ways that we are not enough, not rich enough, not connected enough, not important enough to matter. Her voice rose. But we are enough. We have always been enough. And the world needs what we have to offer. Our resilience, our compassion, our refusal to give up even when everything seems hopeless. She paused. So I challenge you. Be the person who helps. Be the one who gives the stranger your dinner, even when you have nothing. Be the one who sees the invisible people and refuses to walk past them. She smiled. Because you never know. The stranger you help today might be the one who changes the world tomorrow. And even if they're not, even if they're just an ordinary person who needed a moment of kindness, you will have made a difference. You will have proven that humanity is still alive in a world that often seems to have forgotten it. She looked out at the audience one final time. My mother named me Esperanza, hope. For most of my life, I didn't understand why. I didn't feel like hope. I felt like survival, like struggle, like barely hanging on. Her voice softened. But now I understand. Hope isn't a feeling. It's a choice. A choice to believe that kindness matters, that people matter, that the darkness doesn't get to win. She raised her diploma high. So be the hope graduates. Be the light. Be the kindness that someone else needs to believe in the world again. The auditorium erupted in applause. And in his seat, Jonathan Cross wept. Not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming gratitude for a 17-year-old girl who had saved his soul with a styrofoam container of rice and fish. Epilogue 10 years later, Dr. Miguel Santos stood at the podium of a major hospital in Manila, delivering his first address as the new chief of pediatrics. In the front row sat his sister, Esperanza, now a professor of social work at the University of the Philippines, an advocate for the poor, and the author of 3 books on community development. Beside her sat Jonathan Cross, older now, but healthier than he had been in decades. He had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Cross Industries years ago, devoting his energy instead to the Cross Santos Foundation, a joint venture dedicated to supporting education, healthcare, and economic opportunity in underserved communities around the world. The foundation had helped over 100,000 families in the Philippines alone. But Jonathan never forgot where it all began. Every year, on the anniversary of the day Esper gave him her dinner, he returned to Tondo. He walked the same streets he had walked as a pretend homeless man. He sat on the same corner. He remembered, and then he spent the day doing what Esper had taught him. Helping, feeding, seeing, not because he expected anything in return, but because that was who he had become. On this particular anniversary, after Miguel's speech had ended and the crowd had dispersed, Jonathan found himself standing alone on a quiet street corner. The neighborhood had changed in 10 years. Many of the makeshift homes had been replaced by proper housing, some of it funded by his foundation. The Sari Sari store where Esper had sat with him was still there, though now expanded and thriving. Kuya Jonathan? He turned. Esper was standing behind him, holding a familiar styrofoam container. I brought you something, she said, smiling. Rice and fish. For old time's sake. Jonathan laughed. A deep, genuine laugh that came from somewhere he hadn't known existed before he met her. You know I can afford my own dinner now, he said. I know. Esper sat down on the curb and patted the space beside her. But you looked hungry. Jonathan sat. They ate together, the billionaire and the girl who had saved him, watching the sun set over the Manila skyline. Do you ever regret it? Esper asked quietly. Giving away so much of your fortune? Changing your whole life? Jonathan considered the question. I regret not doing it sooner, he finally said. I regret the decades I wasted chasing money instead of meaning. I regret the people I hurt, the relationships I destroyed, the humanity I lost along the way. He looked at her. But I don't regret for a single second the day I sat down on this street corner and you decided to help me. That was the best day of my life. Esper leaned her head on his shoulder. You know what my mother would say? What? She would say that God doesn't waste suffering, that every struggle, every loss, every moment of pain, it all leads somewhere. It all has meaning. She smiled. I think meeting you was where my suffering led. And I think meeting me was where yours led. And together, we've helped so many people find their way. She paused. That's not a bad ending for a story, is it? Jonathan felt tears pricking at his eyes. No, he whispered. That's not a bad ending at all. They sat together in comfortable silence, the billionaire and the girl who had nothing, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. And somewhere, in the streets around them, strangers were helping strangers. Food was being shared. Kindness was being passed forward. Not because anyone expected something in return, but because that was who humanity could be when given the chance. And that is the end of our story. If you made it this far, you understand what this was really about. It wasn't about a billionaire learning a lesson. It was about all of us remembering something we've forgotten. The poor don't help each other because they're angels. They do it because they know what it feels like to have nothing. They know the devastating loneliness of being invisible. And they refuse to let someone else feel that way when they have the power to change it. Jonathan Cross went to the Philippines looking for proof that humanity was selfish. Instead, he found proof that the human heart, at its core, is designed to give. If this story touched you, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling me about a time someone showed you unexpected kindness. Share this with someone who needs to believe that good people still exist. And the next time you see someone struggling, someone the world has made invisible, stop. See them. Help them. Because you never know whose life you might change, including your own. I'll see you in the next one. The measure of a person isn't in what they have. It's in what they give.